He had $10 left in the world, and even that felt like more than he deserved. Daniel Mercer sat behind the wheel of his battered pickup truck, staring through a windshield blurred by rain, wondering how a man could serve his country, survive war, bury his pride, and still end up with nothing but a damp blanket, an empty gas tank, and a dog who refused to give up on him. The rain had been falling for 3 straight days over Port Townsend, Washington. Not the gentle kind of rain people romanticized in postcards or coffee shop windows. This rain came cold and sideways off Puget Sound, slipping through jacket seams, soaking into boots, and settling deep in the bones. The harbor looked half asleep beneath the gray sky. Fishing boats rocked against weathered docks. Seagulls circled above the marina, their cries torn apart by the wind. Somewhere beyond the fog, a ferry horn sounded low and lonely. Daniel did not move. His hands rested on the steering wheel, scarred knuckles pale from the cold. At 56, he still carried the frame of the Navy SEAL he had once been. Broad shoulders, watchful eyes, the kind of posture that made strangers assume he had everything under control. But control was the one thing life had taken from him piece by piece. A failed security business had started the fall. Then came the injury that kept him from taking steady work. Then came the medical bills, the late mortgage notices, the calls he stopped answering because he already knew what they wanted. The house went first, then the savings, then the tools, then the furniture. Finally, even the old friendships seemed to disappear, not all at once, but quietly, like lights going off in distant windows. For 6 months, his truck had been home. It was a 15-year-old Ford with rust around the wheel wells, cracked vinyl seats, a heater that worked only when it felt charitable, and one headlight that flickered whenever the engine idled too long. The only living soul still beside him was Titan. The German Shepherd lay curled across the passenger seat beneath a faded blue blanket. His dark sable coat rose and fell with each steady breath. His muzzle had begun to gray, especially around the eyes, but there was nothing weak about him. Titan had the quiet dignity of a dog who had seen too much and stayed loyal anyway. He had served beside Daniel after Daniel left the Navy and began training working dogs for search and rescue teams. When the business collapsed and everything else was sold, Daniel never once considered giving Titan away. Some debts could be negotiated. Some losses could be survived. But a loyal dog was not property. Titan opened one amber eye as Daniel shifted in the seat. Daniel reached over and scratched behind his ear. "Still with me, huh?" Titan answered with a slow wag of his tail and rested his head against Daniel's forearm. For a moment, that small weight nearly broke him. "Before we go any further, tell me where you are watching from. And if you have ever believed that hope can hide in the places everyone else abandons, stay with this story and consider subscribing, because what happened to Daniel and Titan began at the bottom and ended in a place no one at that harbor could have imagined. Daniel opened his wallet. The inside was damp from living too long in a truck. An old driver's license sat behind cloudy plastic. A VA card. A folded photograph of his younger self in uniform beside a man he had spent most of his life trying not to think about. And one $10 bill. That was it. No credit cards. No emergency cash. No checking account worth mentioning. No hidden miracle waiting to arrive by noon. Just $10. He stared at the bill for a long time. It looked too small to carry the weight of a life. $10 could buy coffee and a sandwich. It could buy a few gallons of gas if he found the right station. It could keep Titan fed for another day if Daniel skipped eating. It could not fix anything. Across the harbor, a rusted sign swung in the wind above a small marina office. Auction today. Daniel had noticed it earlier that morning when he drove and looking for a dry place to park. He assumed it would be the usual marina leftovers. Broken generators. Old boat parts. Abandoned storage lockers. Rusted trailers. Things men with garages and money bought because they knew how to turn junk into something useful. Daniel had no garage. He had no money. And lately he was beginning to suspect he was one of the abandoned things himself. Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears came forward. His body went still. Daniel followed the dog's gaze through the wet windshield. A gull landed on the hood of the truck, shook rainwater from its feathers, and stared at Daniel as if it had been sent to deliver bad news. For the first time in days, Daniel laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out rough and unused. "Yeah," he muttered. "I get it. I look terrible." The gull flapped away. But Titan did not relax. He rose carefully, placed both front paws on the dashboard, and looked past the marina office toward the far end of the docks. Daniel knew that posture. Titan was not a dog who stared for no reason. During training exercises, he could separate human scent from mud, fuel, blood, rain, and smoke. He could locate a lost child in dense woods or alert to a body beneath collapsed debris. Daniel had learned years earlier that when Titan locked onto something, dismissing him was usually a mistake. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Titan's tail tapped once against the seat. The rain softened around noon. Gray clouds broke in uneven places, allowing thin shafts of pale sunlight to fall across the water. Daniel shut off the truck, gathered the last of his dignity, and stepped outside. The air smelled of salt, wet wood, diesel fuel, and old rope. Titan hopped down beside him and shook himself from nose to tail, sending cold drops across Daniel's jeans. "Thanks," Daniel said. Titan looked pleased with himself. They walked toward the marina office together. A small crowd had gathered near the docks, most of them wearing heavy work jackets, rubber boots, and the wary expressions of people who understood boats too well to be easily impressed. Fishermen, mechanics, marina hands, a few bargain hunters, men who could glance at an engine and tell whether it had life left in it, women who knew the value of a good set of tools, people with jobs, homes, and plans for the weekend. Daniel stood near the back. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a red face and a voice built for cutting through wind, moved quickly through the first items. A dented generator sold for $50. A pair of outboard motors went for $120. A metal toolbox drew a brief bidding war between two mechanics who clearly hated each other but respected the same brand of socket wrench. Daniel watched in silence, one hand resting on Titan's back. Then the auctioneer turned toward the far end of the marina. A few people began laughing before he even spoke. Floating alone beside an aging dock was a houseboat. At least, Daniel assumed it had once been a houseboat. Time had not been kind to it. Rust stained the railings. Paint peeled from the cabin walls in long strips. One window was boarded over with warped plywood. The roof sagged near the rear. Green algae marked the waterline. The deck looked tired enough to complain under a man's weight. A faded name had once been painted near the bow, but salt, rain, and neglect had erased most of the letters. It looked exhausted. It looked unwanted. It looked exactly how Daniel felt. "All right," the auctioneer called, trying not to smile. "Next item is the vessel currently tied at slip D17. Paperwork is clean. Buyer accepts all condition issues. Removal or slip fees are buyer's responsibility. Starting bid, $10. A fisherman near the front snorted. "You couldn't pay me $10 to take that thing." Another man shook his head. "Been sitting there for years. Probably leaks shame." Laughter moved through the crowd. Daniel did not laugh. Titan stepped forward. The German shepherd's ears were fixed on the houseboat. His gaze did not wander. His entire body seemed to lean toward the vessel with quiet insistence. Daniel looked down at him, then back at the boat. The auctioneer raised his clipboard. "Do I hear $10? No hands went up. $10, he repeated. "Legal ownership, keys, and whatever problems come with it." More laughter. Daniel felt the folded bill in his pocket. $10 could buy a meal. It could buy time. A very small amount of time. But time for what? Another night curled behind the steering wheel? Another morning pretending not to notice the way people avoided looking at him when they realized he was sleeping in his truck? The houseboat rocked gently against the dock, absorbing every insult without protest. The auctioneer lowered his clipboard. "All right, if there are no bids, $10. The words left Daniel's mouth before caution could stop them. Every head turned. A man in a green rain jacket looked Daniel up and down, then glanced at Titan. Someone chuckled. Someone else whispered, "That poor guy." The auctioneer raised his eyebrows. "I have $10. Any other bids?" Silence. The harbor itself seemed to pause. Going once. No one moved. Going twice. Titan remained perfectly still. "Sold." The gavel struck the folding table with a sharp crack. Just like that, Daniel Mercer became the owner of a dying houseboat. 30 minutes later, he stood on the dock holding a ring of keys, a thin folder of ownership documents, and the strange feeling that he had either made the most foolish decision of his life or the first brave one in months. An older marina worker approached him while the crowd drifted away. The man had a white beard, a knit cap pulled low, and the careful eyes of someone who had spent his whole life around water. "Name's Walt," he said. "I manage maintenance around here." "Daniel." Walt looked at the houseboat. "Son, I hope you know what you're doing." Daniel gave a faint smile. "That makes one of us." Walt laughed, but there was concern underneath it. "Slips paid through the end of the month because the marina wanted it gone. After that, you'll need to make arrangements." "I understand. You got somewhere to stay besides this?" Daniel looked toward his truck. Walt followed his gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded toward Titan. "Good dog. The best." Walt studied him a second longer, as if deciding whether to offer advice Daniel would be too proud to accept. "There's a shower at the north end of the marina. Codes written inside the office door. Don't make a mess and nobody will bother you." Daniel swallowed. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. That boat might sink your gratitude by morning." Titan stepped onto the houseboat first. He moved carefully but confidently across the deck, nose low, paws silent. Daniel followed. The vessel shifted. Beneath his weight, not violently, but enough to remind him that he had just spent his last $10 on something floating in cold water. The main cabin smelled of dust, mildew, old wood, and stagnant air. Dirty windows filtered the afternoon light into a gray haze. A small table sat near the galley beside two broken chairs. Empty shelves lined one wall. A cracked mug rested in the sink. The sleeping area contained a thin mattress stained by years of neglect. Cobwebs filled the corners like abandoned lace. It was ugly. It was damp. It was his. That last thought landed harder than he expected. For 6 months, every place Daniel slept belonged to someone else. A parking lot. A rest area. A side street where the police might knock on the window at 2 in the morning. Even the truck felt temporary, because one mechanical failure could take it from him. But this battered boat, this floating insult at the end of the dock, belonged to him. He spent the afternoon cleaning. He carried broken chairs onto the dock, filled trash bags with damp cardboard, cracked plastic, rotting rope, and things he did not want to identify. He opened every window he could pry loose. He swept dust from the floor until his back ached. Titan explored the cabin, the galley, the sleeping area, the narrow hallway leading toward the engine compartment. Every few minutes the dog returned to check on him, as if reminding Daniel that exhaustion was not the same as defeat. By evening, the rain had stopped. The harbor turned silver beneath a clearing sky. Lights from the marina flickered on one by one, trembling across the water. Daniel sat on the deck wrapped in his old blanket, eating half a granola bar he had found in the truck. Titan lay beside him, head on his paws. "Not exactly luxury," Daniel said. Titan leaned against his leg. Daniel looked out over the water and felt something fragile move in his chest. Not happiness. Not yet. But possibility. For the first time in months, he had a roof over his head. A leaky roof, probably. A sagging roof. A roof attached to a vessel everyone else had mocked. But still a roof. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the sound. Daniel closed his eyes. Then Titan stood. The movement was quiet, but Daniel felt it immediately. The German shepherd's body had gone alert. He walked toward the rear of the boat, past a coil of old rope and a stack of cracked storage crates, and stopped beside a rusted hatch near the engine compartment. He stared at it. Daniel waited. Titan looked back at him. The expression in those amber eyes was unmistakable. It was the same look he had worn at the auction. The same look Daniel had seen in disaster sites, collapsed buildings, and forest searches. Not curiosity. Certainty. Daniel stood slowly. "What is it, buddy?" Titan lowered his nose to the seam around the hatch, sniffed once, then looked at Daniel again. A chill moved through Daniel that had nothing to do with the weather. The old houseboat rocked gently beneath them. Somewhere below the floor, hidden under years of rust, paint, neglect, and silence, something waited. Daniel barely slept that night. The boat made 100 unfamiliar sounds. Water tapped the hull in soft, patient rhythms. Wind rattled loose trim near the stern. A rope creaked against a cleat. But none of it kept him awake the way Titan's behavior did. Daniel had trusted Titan with his life more than once. When the dog fixed on something, there was almost always a reason. At sunrise, pale gold light spread across the harbor. Fog hovered low over the water. Fishing boats moved slowly toward open sound, their engines murmuring in the morning quiet. Daniel climbed from the narrow berth, rubbed stiffness from his shoulder, and found Titan already waiting by the hatch. "Of course you are," Daniel said. Titan wagged once. Daniel gathered a flashlight, a flathead screwdriver, a small wrench, and a hammer from a toolbox left behind in the galley. The hatch sat partly hidden beneath storage crates and tangled rope. Up close, it looked different from the rest of the boat. The metal was thicker. The hinges seemed custom-made. Layers of paint had been brushed over the edges again and again, not carelessly, but deliberately, almost as if someone had wanted it to disappear. Daniel crouched and ran his fingers along the seam. The bolts were wrong. Not new exactly, but newer than the surrounding hardware. Someone had replaced them long after the boat was built. That made no sense for a forgotten engine hatch no one used. Unless it was not an engine hatch. Daniel worked slowly. Rust fought him. Paint cracked beneath the screwdriver. 2 bolts snapped. One refused to move until he struck the wrench with the hammer and muttered words he would not have said in front of children. Titan sat nearby, patient and focused, never wandering away. An hour passed. Then the hatch shifted. Daniel braced his boots against the deck and pulled. Metal groaned. Something beneath released with a sound like a long-held breath. Cool air rose from below. Daniel aimed the flashlight down. The beam vanished into darkness, then caught the top of a narrow ladder descending below the engine compartment. He stared. Houseboats this size were not supposed to have hidden lower rooms. Not like this. Not below the waterline, sealed behind a hatch painted to look unimportant. Titan stepped forward. "Easy," Daniel said, placing a hand on his chest. "We go together." The dog waited. Daniel climbed down first, one rung at a time. The ladder was sturdy. The air below was dry, cool, and still. When his boots touched the floor, he swept the flashlight across the room and forgot to breathe. It was not a storage space. It was a hidden compartment, carefully built and remarkably preserved. Wooden shelves lined one wall. File boxes sat stacked in neat rows. Old trunks rested beneath protective tarps. A small desk stood against the far side, its surface covered by a faded cloth. Photographs were pinned to corkboards. Journals filled a crate. Metal boxes rested on the floor. Everything was dusty, but not ruined. Someone had prepared this room to survive. Titan came down beside him and moved directly toward the desk. Daniel followed. On the floor beneath it sat a metal box about the size of a briefcase. It showed almost no rust. No lock. No label. Only an envelope taped to the lid. The paper had yellowed with time. 2 words were written across the front in careful handwriting. "If found." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He removed the envelope as gently as if it might crumble. Inside was a folded letter written in blue ink. The handwriting was elegant, steady, and deeply human. The first sentence made the room seem to tilt. "If you are reading this, then the boat finally found the right person." Daniel sat on the edge of the desk chair. Titan lowered himself beside him. The letter continued. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. If this room has survived, then perhaps my story can survive too. I do not know who you are, but I know this much. A person who opens a hidden door must decide whether to walk away or accept what waits inside. I hope you are the kind of person who understands that some things are not valuable because they can be sold. Some things are valuable because they should not be forgotten." Daniel looked around the room. The shelves, the photographs, the records, the journals, the careful order of it all. He had bought the boat hoping for shelter. Instead, he had found someone's life. For the next several hours, Daniel read. Eleanor Hayes had lived aboard the houseboat decades earlier. She had worked odd jobs around the coast, mostly bookkeeping, caregiving, and seasonal work for local businesses, but her real life's work had been quieter. During years when fishing towns struggled, when families lost income to storms, injury, illness, or bad luck, Eleanor organized help. Food deliveries, temporary housing, school supplies, gas money, utility bills paid before heat was shut off. Emergency repairs for boats that were a family's only source of income. She did not run a charity with a logo. She did not seek newspaper attention. She simply noticed who was hurting and found a way to help. Daniel opened file after file. Each one contained names, dates, letters, photographs, and notes. A widower who kept his home after Eleanor negotiated with his lender and quietly covered 2 missed payments. A teenage girl who received application fees and bus money to attend nursing school in Seattle. A family whose fishing boat was repaired after a storm destroyed their savings. A boy whose mother could not afford winter clothes, pictured years later in a graduation gown. Titan watched quietly while Daniel worked through the records. The dog had fulfilled his duty. He had found the hidden thing. Now he seemed content to let Daniel understand why it mattered. Near the back of the room, Daniel discovered a leather-bound journal labeled personal. The early entries showed warmth and humor. Eleanor wrote about learning to repair plumbing with library books, burning oatmeal during a winter storm, rescuing a gull tangled in fishing line, and arguing with a marina manager who claimed women had no business living alone on a boat. Her voice on the page was sharp, kind, practical, and stubborn. But as the years passed, the tone changed. Friends died. Organizations closed. Families moved away. Records were lost. Stories faded. Eleanor began worrying that the truth of what people had survived and the help that had carried them through might vanish with her. One passage stopped Daniel cold. People chase money. They chase fame. They chase the comfort of being praised for kindness. But responsibility is quieter than praise. It asks only this: when you find a story worth saving, will you save it? Daniel closed the journal and pressed it against his knee. For months, he had thought his own story was over. A veteran who could no longer keep up. A business owner who failed. A man too proud to ask for help until no one was left to ask. Sitting in that hidden compartment, surrounded by proof of lives rescued from the edge, he realized he had been wrong about something important. Some stories did not end at the bottom. Some stories began there. Over the next several days, Daniel divided his time between basic repairs above deck and reading below. Walt let him use a marina outlet for a work light after Daniel helped him move lumber from a storage shed. A mechanic named Rosa gave him leftover cleaning supplies. A fisherman dropped off half a bag of dog food, pretending it was extra so Daniel would not feel embarrassed. Daniel accepted these small kindnesses badly at first. He was polite, but stiff. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. Need made him feel exposed. But each evening, he returned to Eleanor's records and found another example of someone who had survived because they were brave enough to receive help before they were strong enough to give it. That truth worked on him slowly. Titan stayed close. He slept near the hidden hatch. He followed Daniel onto the dock. He greeted Walt with formal dignity and accepted treats from Rosa with less dignity than Daniel preferred. One rainy afternoon, Daniel opened a box labeled Community Records. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Some were folded in envelopes. Others were tied with ribbon. Many began with "Dear Friend" because the writers did not know Eleanor's name. A young man thanked an anonymous donor for helping him finish trade school. A mother described how she cried when groceries appeared on her porch after her husband's accident. An elderly couple wrote that they had spent their first warm night in weeks after someone repaired their furnace. Daniel read until his vision blurred. During his years in uniform, he had seen courage in extreme forms. Men running toward gunfire. Medics treating wounds under impossible pressure. Teammates risking everything because leaving someone behind was unthinkable. But Eleanor's records reminded him of another kind of courage. The kind that woke up every morning in ordinary clothes and decided not to look away from other people's pain. That kind of courage did not receive medals. Maybe that was why it mattered so much. Titan suddenly rose and walked toward a lower shelf Daniel had not inspected. He sniffed along the boards, then pawed gently at a wooden box tucked behind a row of journals. Daniel frowned. "You're doing this again?" Titan looked at him. "All right. I'm listening." The box was small, dusty, and held shut with a simple brass latch. Inside was a bundle of photographs tied with faded blue ribbon. The first showed Eleanor in her 30s, standing beside the houseboat before time had weathered it. She had windblown hair, a bright smile, and the posture of a woman who trusted her own 2 feet. The second photo showed her surrounded by children on a dock, each holding a paper bag of what looked like school supplies. The third showed a community meal in a church basement. The fourth, a storm shelter. Then Daniel reached the final photograph. He stopped. Eleanor stood beside a man, wearing a military uniform. The man was younger than Daniel remembered him, but there was no mistaking the straight shoulders, the serious eyes, or the half-smile that never fully revealed what he felt. Robert Mercer, Daniel's father. For several seconds, Daniel could not move. His father had died 9 years earlier in Spokane after a stroke. Their relationship had been complicated, which was the polite word Daniel used when he did not want to explain that some wounds are created not by cruelty, but by distance, pride, and silence. Robert had been gone for long stretches during Daniel's childhood. Later, when Daniel was old enough to be angry, he interpreted every absence as proof that his father had chosen work, duty, or anything else over him. By the time Robert tried to reconnect, Daniel had already built a wall strong enough to survive apologies. Or so he thought. Daniel turned the photograph over. A newspaper clipping had been folded and tucked behind it. The article described a coastal flood nearly 30 years earlier. Families had been stranded. Volunteers had delivered supplies and helped evacuate elderly residents. Among those mentioned were local advocate Eleanor Hayes and decorated Navy veteran Robert Mercer. Daniel read the names again. His throat tightened. Beneath the clipping was a letter addressed to Eleanor. The signature at the bottom was his father's. Daniel unfolded it with unsteady hands. The first lines were simple. Gratitude for her work. Concern for families still rebuilding. A promise to send additional contacts who might help. Then came a sentence that made Daniel's breath catch. Thank you for helping my son when I could not. The hidden room seemed to shrink around him. Titan approached and rested his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel placed one hand between the dog's ears, not scratching, just holding on. My son, Daniel whispered. He searched the box again, now moving with the careful urgency of a man afraid of what he might find and more afraid of finding nothing. Beneath the photographs and letters was a thick journal wrapped in blue cloth. A note on the cover read, "For Daniel, if he ever finds this place." He stared at his own name, until the letters blurred. Then he opened the journal. Eleanor's handwriting filled the first pages. She described meeting Robert Mercer during the flood recovery effort. She wrote that Robert was a man of discipline and service, but also a man carrying deep regret. He had spoken often of his son, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a person circles the same ache because there is no road back to it. Daniel read on. According to Eleanor, Robert had tried to send letters during Daniel's adolescence, but some were returned after Daniel and his mother moved. Later, Robert had sent messages through relatives who never passed them along because they believed reopening the relationship would cause more pain. There had been misunderstandings, bad timing, pride on both sides. Years when both father and son waited for the other to make the first move and mistook silence for indifference. Daniel pressed his knuckles to his mouth. He remembered being 16 and telling himself he did not care. 21 and refusing to answer a birthday card. 30 and too busy building a career to sit with the boy inside him who still wanted an explanation. 45 and standing at his father's funeral, dry-eyed, convinced that grief had passed him by because there was not enough love left to mourn. Now, beneath an abandoned houseboat he had bought for $10, Daniel discovered that the story he had carried all his life was not the whole truth. Eleanor had known. She had promised Robert that if the opportunity ever came, she would help Daniel understand. After Robert died, she quietly followed Daniel's life from a distance, not intrusively, not obsessively, but through public records, newspaper notices, veterans' newsletters, and community contacts. She saved a clipping from Daniel's military graduation, a photo from a volunteer search and rescue fundraiser, a newspaper mention of his dog training business before it failed. Beside one clipping, she had written, "Robert would have been proud. I wish Daniel knew that." Daniel bowed his head. For a long time, he did not cry. He had learned long ago how to control his breathing, how to remain functional when grief moved through a room like smoke. But the body has its own memory. A man can survive combat, loss, hunger, humiliation, and loneliness, then be undone by one sentence written in a stranger's hand. I wish Daniel knew that. The first tear fell onto the page before he realized it had escaped. Titan whined softly. Daniel wiped his face and laughed once, broken and quiet. "I'm okay, buddy." Titan did not appear convinced. The final pages of the blue journal revealed Eleanor's plan. Several years earlier, after learning that Daniel's business was struggling and that his health had worsened after an injury, Eleanor began making arrangements. She had purchased the houseboat through a small holding company after it was abandoned by a previous owner. She could not restore it fully. By then her own health was failing. But she rebuilt the hidden compartment, preserved her records, and placed Daniel's story among them. She could not force him to come. She could only create a chance. The boat was to be released through a marina auction after her death, with no announcement and no special attention. She wrote that if Daniel had become the kind of man Robert believed him to be, perhaps he would recognize something worth saving in a vessel everyone else dismissed. At the end of one entry, she added, "Sometimes people must lose the life they were clinging to before they can find the truth that was waiting underneath it." Daniel sat back, stunned. For months, he had believed homelessness was proof that his life had collapsed into meaninglessness. The shame had been unbearable because he thought it erased everything that came before. His service, his work, his discipline, his love for Titan. But Eleanor's hidden room did not erase his failure. It placed it inside a larger story. Maybe he had not been abandoned. Maybe he had been led. Not magically, not easily, not without pain, but led all the same. The last note in the journal made him laugh through fresh tears. "If Daniel arrives with the German Shepherd, I will know I chose correctly. Trust the dog. Dogs are better judges of hidden rooms and broken men than the rest of us." Daniel looked at Titan. The dog's tail thumped once. "So you were part of the plan all along," Daniel said. Titan leaned into him as if this had been obvious from the beginning. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn. For the first time in months, uncertainty did not feel like a hand around his throat. The harbor outside was quiet, mist floating over the water. Titan stood at the bow, watching sunrise paint the clouds gold and pale blue. Daniel joined him with a cup of instant coffee made in the cleaned galley. "What now?" he asked softly. Titan watched the water. Daniel already knew the answer. Eleanor had not left him money. She had left him responsibility. She had left him the records of people who deserved to be remembered, the truth about a father he had misunderstood, and a living example of what a life could mean when it was spent helping others stand back up. Later that day, Daniel walked to the Port Townsend Public Library with a folder of copied photographs and clippings tucked beneath his jacket. The old brick building sat near the waterfront, warm and dry inside, smelling of paper, coffee, and polished wood. A librarian named Margaret Collins greeted him from behind the desk. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly back and reading glasses hanging from a chain. "How can I help you?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. Explaining the hidden room sounded absurd, but he had spent too much of his life protecting himself with silence. "I found some local history," he said. "I think it matters." Margaret led him to a table near the archives room. At first, she did not recognize the images. Then Daniel placed the photograph of Eleanor outside a storm shelter in front of her. Margaret's expression changed. "Wait," she whispered. "I know that face." She disappeared into the archives and returned 20 minutes later carrying a stack of old newspapers and community newsletters. Together they searched through yellowing pages, microfilm printouts, and brittle clippings. Slowly, Eleanor Hayes reappeared, not as a celebrity, not as a public figure, but as a familiar name tucked into the margins of local history. Volunteer organizer, emergency coordinator, friend of the harbor, a woman present after floods, layoffs, fires, medical crises, school closures, and winter storms. She was mentioned briefly, often in passing, while the focus remained on the people who had been helped. Margaret studied the articles with growing emotion. "Most people spend their lives trying to be remembered," she said quietly. She spent hers making sure other people could keep going. Daniel nodded. That sentence stayed with him all the way back to the marina. Over the next few weeks, the old houseboat began to change. Not quickly. Daniel had no money for dramatic repairs. But he had hands, patience, and a reason. Walt showed him how to patch weak spots in the deck using salvage boards. Rosa found a used bilge pump and refused payment. A retired electrician named Sam checked the wiring and declared it terrifying, then spent 2 evenings making it less terrifying. Someone left a bag of groceries on the dock. Someone else left a stack of clean towels. Daniel suspected Walt was behind half of it. Walt denied everything. Titan accepted every visitor as if he were supervising a renovation crew. The boat still looked rough. Rust remained on the railings. The roof still needed work. But the windows were clean. The galley functioned. The sleeping area no longer smelled like mildew. The hidden compartment was protected with a new seal around the hatch. Daniel organized Eleanor's records into labeled boxes and began making digital copies at the library. Piece by piece, the vessel stopped looking abandoned. Piece by piece, Daniel did too. One Saturday morning, he placed a handwritten notice on the marina bulletin board. Community history gathering. Photos and records connected to Eleanor Hayes. Coffee on Dock D. All welcome. He expected 5 people. More than 40 came. At first, they arrived out of curiosity. Older residents, marina workers, a few families, Margaret from the library, Walt, Rosa, and Sam. Titan stood beside Daniel with solemn importance, as if greeting witnesses at a ceremony. Daniel had arranged copies of photographs and articles on a long table. He spoke briefly, his voice rough with nerves. "This isn't about me," he said. "I bought this boat at auction because I had nowhere else to go. My dog found a hidden compartment below deck. Inside were records kept by a woman named Eleanor Hayes. I think some of you may know pieces of her story. I'm hoping we can put those pieces together." For a moment, no one spoke. Then an old fisherman lifted one photograph with trembling fingers. "I know this dock," he said. "That was after the storm of '94. A woman beside him leaned closer. "That's my brother. He was 12. Someone else pointed to a clipping. "My mother talked about this. She said a woman helped them when my grandfather got hurt." Stories began moving through the crowd like wind through tall grass. A retired fisherman remembered losing his boat in a storm and finding repair money raised before he even knew how to ask. A woman in her 70s recalled school supplies appearing on her porch in paper bags with no name attached. A man said his daughter's college application fees had been paid anonymously after he lost his job. Another remembered Eleanor bringing groceries to a motel where 3 families were staying after an apartment fire. Nobody had known the full pattern. Each person had believed their family's help was an isolated act of kindness. Now, spread across the table, the truth became undeniable. Eleanor had spent decades building a chain of mercy across the coast, link by link, person by person, never asking anyone to admire her for it. Daniel stood near the edge of the gathering, listening. For once, he did not feel the need to lead, explain, or control the room. He simply let the stories return to the people who had carried them unknowingly for years. Then an elderly woman approached. She was small, neatly dressed, and holding a faded photograph against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly. "I think this belongs with the others," she said. Daniel accepted it carefully. The photo showed a younger Eleanor standing outside a community shelter with several volunteers and families. The woman pointed to a 17-year-old girl near the edge of the picture. "That's me," she whispered. The conversations around them softened. "My name is Grace Wilburn," she said. "My family lost everything after a winter storm. Our trailer flooded. My father was injured. My mother had nowhere to take us. Eleanor found us a place to stay. She brought food, clothes. She sat with my mother when my mother couldn't stop crying." Grace wiped her eyes. "I spent years wondering how to thank her. I thought maybe I had waited too long." Daniel looked at the photograph, then at Grace. She smiled through tears. "Now I think the best way is to help someone else." Something moved through the crowd then. Not applause, not excitement. Something quieter and more lasting. Recognition. People understood. Eleanor's legacy was not a museum piece. It was not meant to sit in boxes beneath a boat. It was meant to move. One person to another. One need to another. One act of kindness becoming the reason someone else chose kindness later. That evening, after the last visitor left and the marina settled into blue twilight, Daniel returned to the hidden room. It no longer felt like a secret chamber. It felt like a seed that had finally broken open. He opened Eleanor's final journal and found a passage near the back. "Someday the stories will matter more than the records. Someday people will remember each other instead of me. That will be enough." Daniel closed the journal and sat in silence. Above him, Titan's paws crossed the deck. The sound was steady and familiar. Daniel thought of his father, Robert Mercer, who had been proud but unable to say enough while there was time. Daniel thought of all the years he had spent protecting an old wound, as if anger could keep him safe from grief. He thought of Eleanor, who had seen broken connections and chosen not to let them remain completely lost. He could not change the past. He could not call his father, could not demand explanations, could not recover missed birthdays or conversations that pride had buried. But he could decide what to do with the truth now. By summer, people at the marina had given it a name. Hope Harbor. Daniel had not chosen it. In fact, the first time he saw the words painted neatly on a small wooden sign beside the slip, he tried to blame Walt. Walt lifted both hands. "Don't look at me." Rosa grinned from behind him. It was everybody. Daniel stared at the sign, embarrassed and moved in equal measure. Hope Harbor. The name could have sounded sentimental on another vessel. On that one, it felt earned. Fresh paint covered the worst sections of the cabin. Flower boxes hung near the windows because Grace insisted the boat needed color. The deck had been repaired. The hidden room was carefully preserved, with copies of the records donated to the local historical society and library. Margaret helped organize an exhibit about Eleanor's work, not as a monument to one woman's goodness, but as an invitation for others to continue it. Then the community started a fund. It began with a coffee can at the marina gathering. Someone dropped in $20. Someone else added $5. A fisherman added $100 and pretended it was a mistake. Rosa designed a simple flyer. Margaret helped with paperwork. Within months, the Eleanor Hayes Harbor Fund was helping local families with emergency groceries, utility bills, school supplies, and temporary housing. Nothing flashy. Nothing that attracted cameras. Just practical help at the moment a person might otherwise fall through the cracks. Daniel became the fund's unofficial caretaker. At first, he resisted. "I'm not qualified," he told Margaret. She looked at him over her glasses. "Were you qualified to buy a houseboat for $10? No. And yet here we are." He had no answer for that. The work changed him. Not all at once. Healing rarely arrives like lightning. More often it comes through routines. Answering a phone call. Delivering groceries. Helping a veteran fill out forms. Driving an elderly man to a medical appointment. Sitting with a single mother at the library while she applied for rental assistance. Listening without rushing to fix everything. Daniel discovered that service after loss felt different from service before it. In the Navy, he had been trained to enter chaos with precision. Now he was learning to enter ordinary pain with humility. He could not save everyone. Eleanor's journals had taught him that. But he could help one person. Then teach that person, when they were able, to help another. Titan remained at the center of it all. Children adored him. Older fishermen brought treats. Volunteers joked that Titan was the director of emotional support and dock security. He greeted visitors at Hope Harbor with calm authority, placing himself between Daniel and anyone whose sadness looked especially heavy, as if he understood that some people needed permission to step closer. Autumn arrived slowly. The mornings turned cooler. Fog lingered longer over the harbor. Fishing boats came back earlier in the evening, their reflections stretching across the bay like ribbons of gold. Hope Harbor glowed at dusk now, not because it was beautiful in any expensive way, but because it was loved. The windows shone warm. The deck was swept. A small American flag moved near the bow. Beside it hung a modest wooden plaque carved by Sam. "If you found this room, help one person. Then teach them to help another." Those were Eleanor's words, taken from the small plaque Daniel had discovered in the final storage box. He had placed the original in the hidden room and the copy where visitors could see it. One crisp October evening, nearly a year after the auction, Daniel sat alone below deck. The hidden compartment had changed too. The dust was gone. The records were preserved in archival sleeves and boxes. A dehumidifier hummed softly in one corner. Photographs had been copied, labeled, and shared with families who had waited decades to understand the kindness that touched them. Eleanor's story was safe now, but Daniel still came down sometimes just to sit. He opened her final journal again. He had read it many times, but that night he noticed a passage near the end written in smaller handwriting than the rest. "If you are reading this, then you already understand the secret. It was never about the boat. It was never about the records. It was never about me. It is about what happens when one act of kindness survives long enough to become another." Daniel read the words twice. Then he closed the journal. Above him, Titan walked across the deck, paws tapping softly on wood. The sound had become one of Daniel's favorite sounds in the world. Proof of presence. Proof that he was not alone. He climbed the ladder and stepped into the evening air. The harbor was wrapped in amber light. The sky glowed crimson near the horizon. Boats rocked gently in their slips. Families laughed from a nearby dock. A radio played faint country music somewhere behind the marina office. Ordinary life moved around him, and for the first time in many years, Daniel did not feel outside of it. Titan sat near the bow, facing the water. Daniel joined him. They remained there in comfortable silence. He thought about the $10 bill, how small it had looked in his hand, how humiliating it had felt to realize it was everything he had left. At the time, he believed he was making a desperate decision because desperation was all he had. But the $10 had not bought a ruined houseboat. It had bought a doorway to Eleanor Hayes. to families who had survived because she refused to look away, to the truth about Robert Mercer, to forgiveness that arrived too late to be spoken face to face, but not too late to change a living man, to a purpose Daniel never would have chosen if life had allowed him to remain comfortable. Titan rested his head against Daniel's leg. Daniel smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good job, buddy," he whispered. Titan closed his eyes, content with the praise. The sun slipped lower. Light danced across the water. For a few moments, the entire harbor seemed covered in gold. Daniel thought of Eleanor working quietly all those years with no guarantee that anyone would remember. He thought of his father carrying regret in silence. He thought of Grace, Mason, Walt, Rosa, Margaret, and every person who had added one small link to a chain of kindness stretching farther than any of them could see. Meaning, Daniel realized, rarely arrives the way people expect. It does not always come as a miracle, a fortune, a rescue, or a grand second chance. Sometimes it comes disguised as a rusted boat nobody wants. Sometimes it comes through a dog who refuses to ignore what everyone else walks past. Sometimes it comes after failure has stripped away every false measure of success and left only the question that matters. What will you do with the life still in your hands? Darkness settled over Port Townsend. The harbor lights flickered on one by one. Hope Harbor rocked gently beneath Daniel and Titan, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. Daniel had started this journey believing he had lost everything. Instead, he discovered that some treasures cannot be locked in a box, deposited in a bank, or measured by what the world calls success.